Hey guys, tonight we stand at the edge of a quiet, sun-dappled savanna where the mist clings like cotton gauze to clusters of age-old stone. Before you rises something vast, something whispering. Great Zimbabwe. Its ancient walls, some taller than a giraffe on tiptoes, wrap around an empty royal complex, its granite blocks dry-fitted so tightly you couldn't slide a playing card between them. No cement, no modern machinery, just human hands, time, and knowledge. The light here feels different, soft like it's been filtered through memory, and the silence. Oh, the silence isn't empty, it's thick. There's a hush that settles deep in your chest. It tells you something happened here. Something great. But no one ever told you the full story. And you're starting to suspect they should have. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, I'd love to know what country and time are you listening from right now? Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background. Hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You shuffle slowly along a worn path, your feet crunching dry grass, the breeze just brushing your neck. As you approach the walls, the scale starts to settle into your bones. These aren't broken farm fences or modest ruins. This is a stone metropolis built centuries ago in what most textbooks still call a tribal zone. And yet here's proof to the contrary, plain as a giraffe in a mango tree. The stonework is precise. Curved walls loop around open courtyards with a kind of rhythmic elegance, like someone was writing music in rock. And they built without mortar. Think about that. Thousands of tons of granite split and stacked by hand. You pause, place a palm on the sun-warmed rock and feel the faintest tremor. Or maybe it's just your heartbeat syncing with something old. Great Zimbabwe wasn't a village. It was a powerhouse. At its peak, roughly 1100 to 1450 CE, it hosted some 20,000 residents. That's as big as some medieval European cities. And yet no iron gates, no towering cathedrals, no written proclamations of kings. Just stones. Stones that say, "We were here, we were great. We didn't need your approval." Historians still argue whether the earliest foundations were laid by the Gokomera or early Shona peoples. But one thing's clear, whoever did it had mastered not only engineering, but aesthetics. There's no randomness here, no clumsy piles. Every course of stone tapers upward like an architect's sigh. Even today, masons shake their heads trying to recreate these walls. And as you walk deeper into the complex, past crumbling towers and shadows that seem to breathe, you catch glimpses of soapstone birds, stylized, dignified haunting. Some perched high atop pillars, some hidden in secret alcoves, each carved from a single stone. No wings, no beaks, just proud, upright figures staring past time. Local legends say these birds were more than symbols, they were messengers, between kings and ancestors, between the living and the spirit world. You half expect one to blink at you. You pretend you wouldn't scream if it did. The morning sun starts burning off the mist, and the warm air smells like acacia blossoms and old dust. You shuffle toward the great enclosure, a towering ring of stone 250 meters around and 11 meters high. You run your hand along its curves like tracing the inside of a fossilized seashell. Inside, there's a narrow conical tower. Tall, smooth, no doorway, no windows. Historians still argue whether it was a granary, a ceremonial beacon, or a tribute to the moon. You stand before it, and whatever its function was, it still radiates dignity. The way a mountain does, the way silence does. And here's the real kicker: despite decades of excavation, no royal throne has ever been found. No treasure hoards, no palatial furniture, just tools, pottery, ivory, trade beads, bone fragments. It's like they wanted to vanish without a trace, and almost did. A soft laugh escapes your lips. If this had been built in Europe, it would be UNESCO'd laser lit, and probably sponsored by a luxury watch brand. But here, you could be the only person in the world looking at it tonight. That feels unfair, and also kind of magical. A gecko scampers across your path, startling a bird into the sky. You tilt your head and notice something: how the walls aren't just tall, but curved. Always curved, as if meant to mimic the hills beyond, as if the builders were sculpting stone to follow the flow of the land, not conquer it. And then as the sun climbs higher, casting sharp shadows across the stone, you sit down. Right on the warm ground. Because walking among these ruins, you don't feel like a tourist. You feel like a time traveler. And you're not sure you want to go back. In this place of forgotten cities, you realize greatness doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it lies quiet behind curved walls, waiting patiently for someone to notice. Or just to listen. You're still sitting there, your back against a stone that hasn't moved in over 600 years, when a breeze nudges through the ruins. It carries the scent of dust, maybe guava leaves, and something you can't name, like the ghost of an idea that never made it to paper. You look again at the walls. Really look. This time your eyes follow the seams, every block nestled like a puzzle piece, no two quite alike, yet each fitting with uncanny precision. These aren't bricks, they're chunks of granite quarried from nearby hills, hammered into shape with tools and patience. It's a bit like building a library by carving each letter of each book from stone, without electricity, while also being a king, or a priest, or just someone really into rocks. And you wonder, not for the last time, how did they do it? They call it dry stone masonry. That means no mortar, no glue, just friction gravity and a perfect sense of weight. One misstep, and your whole structure collapses like a clumsy Jenga tower. But these walls are still standing. Historians still argue whether builders used wooden scaffolds or moved the stones up on ramps made of soil. No blueprints remain, no sketches in the sand, just legends, whispers, and the stones themselves. You imagine a line of workers passing stones hand to hand under a hot sun, children watching from shaded doorways, someone singing to set the pace. You shift to your feet, brushing off red dust, and wander toward the inner complex. It's quieter here. You cross a narrow threshold, almost like entering a house. There's a stone bench tucked in the wall, a niche that might have held tools or offerings, or nothing at all. It feels lived in. There's something deeply human about these ruins, not just the scale, but the details. Rounded doorways, sheltered courtyards, thoughtful little gutters carved into the paths directing rainwater away from dwellings. You step over one and think, whoever lived here hated wet socks just like me. But it's not just clever plumbing. Archaeologists have found fragments of decorated pottery spindle whorls for making thread iron tools and elaborately carved combs. Not primitive stuff, not makeshift. These were not people figuring things out. They had things figured out. And then there's the birds. 7 soapstone birds have been found at Great Zimbabwe, all carved in a distinctive style. Tall, upright bodies, large eyes, no wings, and the heads of different species, eagle fish, eagle, or even mythical hybrids. Their exact purpose, still debated. But they're sacred enough to be on the national flag of Zimbabwe today. You picture one of these birds perched silently atop a tower, catching the sunrise first. Maybe it watched over ceremonies. Maybe it represented ancestral wisdom. Or maybe it was just the local no trespassing sign. Either way, it speaks. And yet for centuries, no one listened. When colonial explorers first stumbled across the ruins in the 19th century, their journals were filled with wide-eyed awe and denial. Surely, they said, this couldn't have been built by black Africans. Cue one of the strangest periods in historical interpretation, where Great Zimbabwe was credited to everyone but the people who actually lived there. The Phoenicians, the Queen of Sheba, even wandering Israelites got a nod. It would have been funny if it weren't so infuriating. You sigh, shake your head, and trail your fingers along the granite again. It's cool now in the shade, and smooth in places from centuries of touch. The structure ahead is called the Valley Complex, a mix of residential ruins, storage pits, and what might have been a sort of city council area. You imagine elders gathered here, cross-legged, deciding trade routes, or settling squabbles about goats. You try not to giggle at the idea of a 1,000-year-old HOA meeting. Your enclosure wall violates the ancient aesthetics of neighborhood harmony. Speaking of enclosures, the builders didn't just go for height, they went for art. The walls are often capped with patterns, herringbone chevrons, vertical stripes. Decorative, yes, but possibly meaningful too. Signals, codes, or just proof that people have always liked things a little fancy. One pattern, the dental, looks like the teeth of a saw. Some scholars think it marked areas of importance or signified hierarchy. Others say it's purely aesthetic. Historians still argue whether these designs conveyed status territory or just looked cool on festival days. You stop near a narrow passage just wide enough for one person. It curves deliberately between two stone walls like a funnel. You walk it slowly and realize how sound changes, how it echoes, traps, and amplifies. The city may have been acoustically designed, not for concerts necessarily, but maybe for rituals, or surveillance, or good old-fashioned intimidation. In some parts of the ruins, if you whisper at one end of the wall, someone 100 feet away can hear you like a stone telephone. You wonder if lovers used it to pass secret messages, or if teenage pranksters used it to yell boo across the courtyards. And yet even with all this mystery, the place doesn't feel alien. It feels recognizable. You see human choices, taste, playfulness, practicality, and dignity. There's a beauty in the restraint, too. Unlike European castles that blare their dominance, Great Zimbabwe whispers. It folds into the earth curves with the land respects the sky. And maybe that's why it's lasted so long. The sun's beginning to fall now, slanting golden light through the upper stones. You take one last look at the great enclosure, at its tall, silent tower, and wonder what stories the stones would tell if only they had mouths. But they don't, so they wait, and you listen. You rise as the afternoon shadows begin to stretch like yawns across the ground, and your feet carry you away from the central ruins down a slope into the valley that once buzzed with life. But you're not done with Great Zimbabwe yet. Not even close. Because now your nose catches something different. Not the usual earthy scent of old stone and acacia bark, but a whisper of salt, spice, and cinnamon. Which is odd considering you're very far from any ocean or coastal spice market. But that's the thing, centuries ago, this place wasn't isolated. Not by a long shot. You reach a shallow ridge overlooking where the ancient market once stood, and the air seems to hum. You imagine people shouting, laughing, trading bundles of gold dust for porcelain ivory, for dyed cloth, and perhaps, yes, cinnamon from ships that once docked thousands of kilometers away. This wasn't just a city. It was an international trading hub before passports were even a thing. Historians agree that from the 12th to 15th centuries, Great Zimbabwe was a center for long-distance trade. The city had no riverside port or obvious natural harbor, but it made up for that with gold. So much gold, in fact, that it dazzled traders from as far away as Kilwa on the Swahili coast. From there, ships carried goods to Arabia, India, and China. You crouch by a scatter of glass beads embedded in the earth relics left behind. These aren't local. Some are Persian, some Chinese. A few might even be from Venice. Think about that. Somewhere in 14th century Italy, Someone shaped glass that ended up here in southern Africa tucked in a pouch beside a granite wall. And of course there's the gold. You close your eyes and picture it, miners deep in the earth coaxing ore from quartz veins, children panning riverbeds with woven baskets, smiths heating tiny furnaces melting nuggets into royal ornaments. The local geology is rich with it, and archaeological digs have uncovered ingots, decorative bangles, and even gold dust preserved in old leather pouches. The gold didn't just fund the city, it defined it. Gold was the reason Arab merchants arrived with their long robes and fine glass. It was the reason Portuguese chroniclers would later speak of inland empires and fabulous cities they couldn't find. It was the glimmer that kept distant maps marked with hopeful XX. But here's the weird part: they didn't hoard it. At least not like the pharaohs did. You won't find great tombs stuffed with treasure or vaults sealed with curses. What you find mostly are hints, impressions, ghosts of wealth passed hand to hand, eventually leaving with the traders who never looked back. Historians still argue whether the rulers deliberately exported the best artifacts or whether what remains is just the leftovers of looting centuries later. But what's left behind says plenty. You walk past a small rock platform partly buried now, and it might have been a trading stall, or a shrine, or both. Here, sacred and economic weren't always separate. You can almost hear someone bartering in Shona, weighing ivory against bolts of indigo-dyed cotton, a sacred bird statue watching silently from above. It's also worth noting that the people of Great Zimbabwe didn't write their history down. No scrolls, no chronicles, just oral traditions passed like delicate pottery from one tongue to the next. That might make you nervous, like trying to trace your family tree by listening to bedtime stories. But you begin to feel it now. The rhythm, the repetition, the elegance of oral history. It isn't less accurate, it's just different. It lives in the breath. It adjusts with the listener. It's memory as performance, not just storage. You pick up a small shard of blue and white porcelain embedded in the dirt like a tiny flag from another life. Chinese? Ming Dynasty. That dates the trade as far as the 14th or 15th century, which means someone right here might have once eaten goat stew from a bowl made in Jingdezhen. You chuckle softly because your brain wants to reach for comparisons. It's like ordering on AliExpress in 1300 AD. Which, yeah, isn't technically accurate, but honestly not that far off. And still no shipping labels, no inventory. Just perfectly coordinated logistics passed through memory trust and trade winds. You turn your gaze eastward, where the distant hills blur into haze. Out there in the dry, shimmering distance is where the trade routes ran across the Limpopo north towards the Swahili city-states. Kilwa, Sofala, Gedi. Elegant names whispered now in the rustle of dry leaves. Imagine the caravan's donkeys plodding under loads of gold incense and dried meat. Merchants stopping to rest beneath baobab trees. Children counting cowrie shells while the elders negotiated over salt blocks and lengths of silk. Trade was not just about objects. It was about stories. About what a bead meant. About where a piece of coral had been before it came here. Historians still argue whether the rulers of Great Zimbabwe acted more like king's merchants or spiritual intermediaries. But you start to suspect it didn't matter. Maybe being powerful here meant being all of those things and knowing when to keep your mouth shut while your city bloomed quietly, far from the noise of European attention. As you stroll back toward the inner walls, you pass a carving, faint now but distinct, a crocodile, or maybe a snake. You're not sure which. It stares with chipped eyes at the path below. A warning, a totem, or just ancient graffiti. The shadows deepen. The crickets begin to chirp. Somewhere nearby, a baboon coughs into the dusk. You're surrounded by a silence that no longer feels empty. It feels earned, as if the land remembers its golden age and is simply resting now, waiting for someone to ask the right question. And maybe that someone is you. You don't leave the highlands of Zimbabwe just yet, not before wandering further back in time. Because long before great Zimbabwe rose into glory, another city laid the foundation, literally. Welcome to Mapungubwe. It's quieter here, less touristy, less famous, but every bit as important. You find yourself standing at the base of a sandstone hill, red and weathered like it's been holding secrets for centuries and refuses to spill them easily. You squint upward. Near the top, there's a plateau, the ancient citadel of the Mapungubwe elite. That's where the royals lived. Not behind gates or moats, but above everyone else. Stone may be the story, but elevation, that was power. You begin to climb. Slowly, carefully. The sun is less playful here. It glares down in wide, white sheets. Your boots scrape the rocks as you ascend the sandstone, crumbling slightly underfoot. You imagine court messengers huffing their way up these same slopes, balancing clay pots on their heads and scrolls in their hands. Okay, probably not scrolls. Mapungubwe, like Great Zimbabwe, left no writing. But still messages were carried. Power was centralized, and from up here you see why. The view stretches in all directions. The confluence of the Limpopo and Shasha rivers glints in the distance. This was no accidental kingdom. It was chosen, built on trade gold and strategic location. And like Great Zimbabwe, it was shrewdly connected to a wider world. You reach the top and pause beside what looks like an unassuming patch of rock. But beneath your feet, royal graves. Burials so rich in symbolism that archaeologists had to invent new categories to describe them. Clay pots, bone ornaments, and most famously a tiny glimmering rhinoceros made entirely of gold foil. It's smaller than you expect, palm-sized, lightweight, but somehow majestic. The gold rhino of Mapungubwe, as it's now known, wasn't just decoration. It symbolized status, nobility, strength. Some say it was the insignia of a king whose name no one remembers, but whose bling game was undeniable. Historians still argue whether Mapungubwe was the first true kingdom in southern Africa. Its rise began around 1075 AD, and its golden age lasted nearly 2 centuries. The elites lived on the hilltop, commoners clustered below. Society was stratified, organized, and surprisingly clean. Excavations suggest the upper-class areas were kept distinctly separate from those below. Waste systems were managed, cattle were corralled, homes were arranged in deliberate clusters. It's a little like an HOA mixed with sacred geometry. You can almost hear a noblewoman muttering, "No, darling, we don't plant marula trees next to the grain pit. It's simply not done." You wander toward a flat clearing near the summit. Broken pottery litters the ground in curved fragments, some with delicate incisions, others with smooth, soot-blackened undersides. You pick one up and feel the groove of a thumbprint pressed there 1,000 years ago. Someone's dinner, someone's story. And still no fortresses, no armies etched into walls, just stone platforms carefully leveled with hands and time. A different kind of strength, one that whispers rather than shouts. The people of Mapungubwe were Bantu-speaking like the later Shona. They farmed millet and sorghum, raised cattle, crafted iron tools and ornaments. Their trading networks stretched wide again, reaching the Swahili coast, the Arab world, even India. They had gold. And they used it, not for hoarding, but for prestige. And then they vanished, or rather they transitioned. Mapungubwe's prominence faded around 1300 just as Great Zimbabwe's began to rise. Historians still argue whether climate change played a role, droughts perhaps, or shifting river paths. Others point to social unrest, internal conflicts, or trade route evolution. You're starting to get used to that phrase, historians still argue, Because really, it's what makes the journey delicious. Every stone has multiple stories. Every absence a mystery. Back down the hill now, your knees wobbling slightly, you pass into the valley below the old settlement zone. Here the remains of mud brick homes still cling to the earth, surrounded by dry acacia trees. You imagine smoke curling from a central hearth, laughter over a morning meal, a child chasing a chicken with more confidence than coordination. You sit beside a collapsed wall and let your mind wander. What did royalty look like here? Not crowns and thrones, but symbolic animal figurines. Gold beads sewn into leather cloaks. Authority conveyed through rituals, ancestors' elevation. Probably no royal decrees, just consensus, or maybe fear, or both. A soft breeze stirs the grasses, and for a second you feel like the city is breathing again. That time isn't as linear as your textbooks insist. That the people of Mapungubwe didn't disappear, they just went quiet. And you think about that gold rhino, still gleaming, still dignified, still looking a little smug if you're honest. Maybe it's earned the right. Because what's more rebellious than building a civilization thriving trading philosophizing without ever needing to shout about it? And what's more thrilling than finding it still waiting long after the shouting has stopped? You leave Mapungubwe with dust on your boots and a sense that you've only scratched the surface. Great Zimbabwe Mapungubwe. Those were the headlines. But now it's time to duck into the fine print, the little details, the things that didn't make the travel brochures. So you slip back into Great Zimbabwe's side alleys. Not the postcard bits with towering walls and soapstone birds, but the quieter sections. The places where regular people cooked dinner, chased goats, and tried not to trip over their own kids. Because if you look closely, really closely, you'll see something clever in how this place was laid out. There are no straight lines, no wide boulevards, no town square for dramatic speeches, just winding passageways, high stone enclosures, and cozy little courtyards tucked away from the main drag. You imagine walking through it at night. The moon casting silver along the stones, your bare feet whispering across packed earth, the scent of burning cow dung in the air. Yes, that was a thing, and someone's grandmother humming a lullaby 2 houses over. But here's the genius: those alleyways weren't random. They were designed with airflow in mind. Narrow passages kept wind circulating, cooling homes during blazing afternoons. Enclosures created microclimates, warm, in the morning shaded by afternoon, just the right amount of breezy. You didn't need fans when the city was the fan. And you're strolling through what might have been a royal residential zone, but it doesn't feel palatial. It feels human. Lived in. You duck under a low lintel, fingers brushing the curve of a half-fallen wall. There's a tiny side chamber here, possibly for storage, possibly for ceremonies, possibly just someone's sulking spot when they got into an argument about millet. The spaces are deliberate, small but intentional. Walled walkways twist and fold, forcing you to slow down, to turn to see only one bit of sky at a time. It's almost meditative until you bump your shin on an ancient step and say something unrepeatable in modern language. Don't worry, the ancestors forgive you. And then there's the acoustics. You pause in a chamber with 2 curved walls facing one another. You hum just softly, and the note vibrates. Not loudly, not dramatically, just enough to make your skin prickle. The walls respond. Whether by accident or genius design, many sections of Great Zimbabwe have sound qualities that modern architects would envy. Historians still argue whether this was intentional, if the people who built these walls knew that a concave shape could bounce sound like a whispering gallery. But you know what you hear, or rather what you feel. And that's what matters. And then there's the privacy. You duck around another corner and realize nobody in this city could see everything at once. There's no balcony for lording over commoners, no watchtower for keeping tabs. This place was designed with layers, for movement, for mystery. Even in a small home, you had nooks, crannies, quiet spaces that belonged to you and no one else. And get this, there's a path that runs behind the main enclosures where guards might have walked silently unseen. Not for intimidation, but for discretion. Respect. Like a silent butler in a tuxedo keeping the peace behind the scenes. Because order didn't need a whip when you had architecture doing half the work. You imagine a family here, kids squabbling over dried figs, a grandmother crushing herbs in a stone bowl, a father carefully laying stones on the next section of the enclosure. Everyone had a role, everyone had a space, and despite the lack of written plans, the city worked. No traffic jams, no wasted space. Every turn mattered. You pass by a shallow pit in the earth, once a kitchen hearth. The ash is long gone, but the groove is still there. Someone cooked here. Someone lit a fire, warmed stew, maybe burned it a little. Someone grumbled about overcooked sorghum just like you would today. Even the toilets had thought put into them. No joke. Certain enclosures had sunken areas for waste strategically placed away from food and water sources. Not glamorous, but necessary. And weirdly comforting. Because it means the people here weren't just surviving. They were thriving, planning, living with intention. And for a city with no streets, it flowed. There were no roads in the traditional sense, no cobblestones, just packed earth and the memory of footfalls. People knew the way because their feet remembered, and the winding paths meant that any stranger would be immediately noticed. That's security without needing walls topped with spikes. You reach the outer enclosure again, looking back over the sprawl of stones, and it dawns on you the very layout of the city was part of its defense. Not a fortress, exactly, but a place that revealed itself slowly like a shy genius with no desire to brag. The winding paths weren't inefficient. They were intentional. A stranger wouldn't know where to go, wouldn't know what lay around the bend. You are slowly learning, but only because you've taken your time. Let the stones guide you. And if you listen closely, you'll notice something else. Birdsong. Wind. The faint shuffle of a lizard. And under that, stillness. Designed stillness. This wasn't just a home. It was a retreat. A sanctuary carved from stone and silence. Not bad for a city with no streets. The late afternoon light drips gold across the stone, and for a moment the walls look like they're glowing from within. You take a deep breath. The air hums, not with noise, but with presence. You round another curve in the ancient maze, and suddenly it hits you. The walls are curved, almost everywhere. Graceful arcs instead of straight lines. You stop and squint. It's not just aesthetic, it's acoustic. You pick a spot and clap softly. There it is, an echo faint but focused, bouncing back at you like a ripple in a pond. Try again. This time a low hum like the air itself is singing back. You whisper something, anything, and the wall doesn't just reflect the sound, it shapes it. The builders of Great Zimbabwe weren't just stacking rocks to look pretty, they were tuning a space. Historians still argue whether this was done deliberately to amplify ritual chants, mask private conversations, or perhaps even create sonic boundaries between public and sacred space. But your ears are convinced. These walls listen, they talk, they hum with memory. You trace your fingers along one of them. The stones are laid with such subtle shifts that the wall feels like it's breathing, slightly bowed, always leaning inward like cupped hands catching sound. It reminds you of a seashell, the kind that always seems to echo the ocean even when it's hundreds of miles away. Maybe these walls echo the past in the same way. There's a particular spot, a narrow courtyard between two thick walls, where archaeologists once noticed a phenomenon. If someone stands at one end and speaks at a specific pitch, the sound amplifies and carries unnaturally far. Think of it as an ancient speaker system built entirely from rock and intuition. No wires, just wisdom. You hum again a low note, and the sound vibrates in your chest like a purring cat. No one taught these builders physics. But they knew resonance. It's not just music. Imagine what it felt like during ceremonies. Dozens of voices chanting, drums echoing, wind threading through the curved spaces. You don't just hear the sound, you feel it. You picture nighttime rituals with flickering firelight and rhythm bouncing around the walls like a living thing. Now not every wall sings. Some just whisper. Others feel like they're keeping secrets. But that's the point, isn't it? Sound was controlled, curated. The city was built to shape experience. That's something most modern cities get wrong with their honking, grinding chaos. But here silence was designed. Noise was sacred. And then, of course, there's the famous conical tower. No doors, no windows, just a smooth, soaring cone of stone. Some say a granary, others a symbol of fertility, or maybe a totem of leadership. Historians still argue whether it served a practical purpose or a purely symbolic one. But here's the thing. When wind passes over it, it makes a low, almost inaudible hum. A bass note. You didn't notice it before. Now you can't unnotice it. And just like that, the tower feels alive. You sit nearby, eyes closed, and start to imagine the possibilities. Maybe certain tones were only used during specific seasons, harvest chants, new moon invocations, royal coronations. Maybe mothers sang lullabies in sonic sweet spots that made the stones vibrate. Maybe young lovers whispered secret promises that only certain walls could keep. You smile. Suddenly the idea of walls have ears feels a little less like paranoia and a little more like folklore based on very real architecture. One researcher proposed that the walls acted as sound traps, capturing echoes so that conversations could remain private. Another claimed they enhanced the acoustics of ritual drumming, focusing the beat like a heartbeat through the stone alleys. Neither theory has been conclusively proven, but honestly, do you care? You're sitting in the middle of a sonic sculpture built 7 centuries ago, and it still works. Even the animals seem to know. A pair of guinea fowl shuffle along a nearby path, cooing softly. The sound bounces off the stone like a duet. A monkey calls from beyond the walls, and it too echoes not wildly but clearly, as if the stones are answering. And maybe that's the key to this whole place. The stones weren't just stacked. They were invited to participate. They were shaped to fit not just physically, but rhythmically, sonically, symbolically. There's another story locals tell that certain stones sing only at night. That if you sit quietly in the right spot, you'll hear a lullaby from the walls themselves. Could be the wind, could be your imagination, could be something older than both. And here's a quirky little detail for you. Some researchers have reported that certain stone configurations seem to vibrate during specific temperatures or humidity levels. Imagine a wall that responds to weather like a xylophone tuned by the atmosphere, a literal forecast in architecture. You chuckle softly at the idea of someone checking their stone wall like, ah yes, the bass note means rain by Thursday. But the laughter fades into wonder again. Because now you realize these weren't just structures, they were instruments, each alley a string, each tower a drum, each courtyard a bell. And together they played the music of a civilization that didn't need to shout to be heard. You lean your head back against the warm granite eyes closed, breathing slow. And for a fleeting second you do hear something. A low note, a pulse, like someone humming to themselves just out of view, or maybe it's just the wind. Either way, the stones are still singing. Your eyes flutter open just as the wind shifts. It brushes your cheek and curls around the walls like it's looking for something, or someone. Maybe it's hunting for an audience because tonight, The sky is clear, the stars are out, and the city is ready for its next trick. You're still surrounded by stone, but now you look up not at the walls this time, but above them. And that's when you notice alignment. The stars rise exactly between two towers. A bright one, possibly Sirius, slips neatly over the edge of a high enclosure. Coincidence? Maybe. But then again, maybe not. You remember the way the conical tower catches the breeze and the way curved walls trap sound. What if those same builders, those same anonymous architects, had also watched the skies? It's not a huge leap. Many ancient cultures did. The Maya, the Egyptians, the Khmer. But in southern Africa, that's where the mystery deepens. Historians still argue whether Great Zimbabwe and its predecessors used astronomical alignments in their city planning. The evidence isn't conclusive. No Stonehenge-like stone circles, no star maps etched into the walls. But there are hints. You begin to follow the layout of certain structures walking slowly as the stars rotate overhead. Some entrances face east toward the rising sun on equinox mornings. Others seem tilted just slightly to the north, as if tracking the movement of the Southern Cross across the sky. In Mapungubwe, researchers once noted a line-of-sight connection between a hilltop grave and a rock formation that aligns with solstice sunrise. Not proof exactly, but let's call it a cosmic coincidence. And here at Great Zimbabwe, the walls themselves may have framed celestial events. Imagine a society that listened to the stars like it listened to the wind through stone. A city that didn't worship the sky with temples but with design, quiet design, silent respect. And then there are the soapstone birds again. Remember those big eyes, no wings, stoic as ever. Scholars debate whether they're purely symbolic or whether they also encoded celestial patterns. Some are shaped with upturned beaks as if they're watching the heavens. One bird even has a weirdly precise 7-point pattern on its base, possibly a constellation. Possibly a counting system. Possibly just a decorative flourish that's making modern scholars spin in circles. You wander into a circular enclosure known for its high platforms. From there you can see nearly every wall under the moonlight. The shadows are long, soft, almost liquid. You imagine priests or elders standing here watching the sky for omens. Venus rising, a red moon, the first streak of the Milky Way, and below them the city sleeping. What did time feel like back then, without clocks, without apps, just stars, just patterns? A whisper in the heavens saying when to plant, when to trade, when to gather. Every culture has their timekeepers. Maybe here they were built into the skyline. Even the city's circular structures, the great enclosure, the towers echo lunar shapes. Maybe not exact models, but gestures. You lie down on a flat patch of ground and watch the sky roll overhead. It feels timeless. Like you could be lying here 1,000 years ago, 1,000 years from now, and still see the same stars. Then you remember something odd archaeologists once found, carved stone discs among the ruins. They're small, perfectly round. No one knows what they were for. Some say they were gaming tokens. Others think they were weights or ceremonial objects. But just maybe they were calendars, star maps in stone. You chuckle quietly. Maybe is doing a lot of work in this story, isn't it? But you don't mind. That's the beauty of ruins. They leave enough blank space for wonder. Another whisper of wind curls around you, and you imagine someone else lying here centuries ago, cheek against the stone, watching Orion climb the horizon. They weren't that different from you. They had questions, too. They probably wondered where the stars went during the day. They probably argued about which constellation looked like a lion and which one looked like a badly drawn guinea fowl. You glance toward the east, and notice that the moon has begun to rise huge and honey-colored. It crests slowly between two distant pillars, almost as if it was choreographed. Okay, that one has to be intentional. You don't say anything. You just breathe. And the city breathes with you. Because this wasn't just a stone metropolis, it was a calendar, a place where architecture and astronomy met in silence, and time didn't tick, it glowed. There's something soothing in that, something that makes you feel small in the best possible way, like being a single note in a much larger song. So you stay there a little longer, letting your heartbeat sync with the stars, the breeze and the echo of forgotten sky watchers who once mapped time with shadows and stone. The moon has climbed higher now, pale and sleepy in the sky. But you're about to step back into daytime, at least in your imagination. Because for all this grand talk of towers and trade routes, sometimes you want to know, what did a normal day look like here? No rituals, no gold rhinos, just breakfast, a conversation, a sneeze. So let's rewind a few hundred years. It's morning in Great Zimbabwe. The sun has barely spilled over the stone walls, and the grass still holds a little dew. You shuffle out of your sleeping nook, maybe a soft mat on packed earth, or a woven bed frame if you're fancy, and immediately trip over a goat. Classic. It blinks at you unimpressed, then ambles off to chew something mildly forbidden. In the distance, a low drumbeat begins. Not ceremonial, just rhythmic, like someone announcing they've lit the first cooking fire of the day. The smell of millet porridge, slightly burnt, drifts through the alleys. Someone's having a breakfast emergency. You follow your nose and find a courtyard half in shadow. A woman is stirring a pot, expertly swatting flies, and children with the same fluid motion. Her daughter, maybe 9, maybe 90, you honestly can't tell, is painting a design on a clay bowl with surprising precision. You squat beside them and ask nothing. You just watch. This is what life looked like, quiet, skilled, rhythmic. There's dignity in routine. The potter's wheel wasn't invented here, but that didn't stop innovation. These bowls were hand-built, shaped by coils and palms, then smoothed with wet pebbles. Fired in open-air kilns, then etched or painted with geometric designs, dots, waves, chevrons. Some symbols might mean things. Others just someone showing off their aesthetics. You peek into a nearby basket. It's filled with cowrie shells used for adornment, sometimes as currency. Next to that, a leather pouch of beads, some made of ostrich shell, some oddly from distant coral or imported glass. You remember those trade routes. Even here in a sleepy morning courtyard, the world was present. Then there's the kid sticky-fingered, dust-covered, and somehow both barefoot and wearing too many necklaces. He holds up a carved wooden animal, an antelope, a lion. You're not sure. But he thrusts it toward you with solemn pride. You accept it. You nod gravely. This seems to satisfy him. He runs off screaming something unintelligible, probably pretending the goat is now cursed. It's a very realistic reenactment of daily life. You wander a bit further, following the sound of soft tapping. A man is sharpening a blade on a stone. It's not a sword, just a farming tool. But it's well cared for. Iron smelting was an art here. In fact, Great Zimbabwe had designated furnaces outside the city center, charcoal-fueled, clay-walled, and fiercely hot. Historians still argue whether blacksmiths held elite or taboo status. Some oral traditions suggest smiths had sacred knowledge linked to lightning transformation, even rainmaking. Others say they were outsiders, tolerated but feared. Either way, the metal sang in their hands. You pause to watch as he dips the blade in water. Steam rises. He doesn't flinch, just nods. Job done. In a nearby enclosure, 2 women laugh over a broken pot. One of them is already mending it with sticky clay and something that might be goat hair. Waste not wasn't just a modern catchphrase. And oh, the clothes! Loose robes dyed with natural pigments, animal hides softened and sewn with plant fibers, intricate beadwork, hairstyles woven like sculptures. Beauty wasn't an afterthought. It was part of life. Every braid, every bracelet, every carved comb told a story, or at least declared I woke up and chose fabulous. You duck into a small chamber and find a quiet man sitting cross-legged on a mat, grinding dried roots into powder. He's a healer, maybe. A diviner. The room smells like camphor and memory. He doesn't speak, just gestures to a bundle of herbs hanging from the ceiling. You don't know what they're for, headaches, snake bites, love potions, but they look powerful, or at least potent enough to clear your sinuses. Children dart past the doorway, shrieking with joy. One stops, looks at you solemnly, and hands you a mango pit. Again, you accept it like it's royal tribute. The economy of respect here is truly top-notch. Then laughter. Loud, genuine, unfiltered. You glance around the corner and see an impromptu wrestling match happening in the dust. Two teenage boys, all elbows and grins, with a small audience cheering them on. You watch as one flips the other, nearly crashing into a goat, the same goat probably. There's no winner, just joy. The kind of physical, ridiculous joy that transcends time. And for a moment, the ruins are gone. The dust, the broken stones, the quiet. You're in it, fully. Not a tourist, not a scholar, just another soul in the city's rhythm, sweating, laughing, dodging goats. Because these places weren't just capitals or ceremonial centers. They were homes, living, breathing neighborhoods, with burned porridge and stubborn children and weird smells and heartbeats. You step back out into the sunlight, blinking. Somewhere a drum taps again. Maybe it's lunch. Maybe it's just someone saying, "We're still here." You believe them. You stroll through the maze-like alleys of Great Zimbabwe, still smiling from your imaginary morning with the potter and her feral goat entourage, when something catches your attention, a stone doorway framed with careful, almost delicate precision. You pause. It feels different. Not grander necessarily, but intentional. Symbolic. You step through. This part of the city feels quieter. Not just the absence of sound, but a kind of hush, like the space itself remembers who used to walk here. And oddly enough, you start noticing little signs, details tucked into the ruins. Extra chambers, wider hearths, smoothed steps. Could it be? Well, maybe you're imagining it. But maybe you've stepped into a space once ruled by women. Historians still argue whether women in Great Zimbabwe and other Bantu-speaking civilizations held formal political power, but oral traditions from surrounding regions suggest something intriguing: matrilineal inheritance. That means lineage passed through the mother's side. A child's identity, property rights, and social standing were all traced through her. Suddenly, that doorway doesn't just lead to a home, it leads to authority. You imagine a woman standing here, hands dusted with millet flour, wearing a necklace of coral and shell surrounded by 3 generations. She isn't secondary. She is the house, the name, the anchor. You sit on a flat stone where someone might have once braided hair or told stories at dusk. And you listen not for the clash of spears or the edicts of kings, but for lullabies, gossip, instructions on how to mend a pot or prepare a charm for good harvests. The kind of power passed from lap to lap, not throne to throne. There's a term still used in parts of Shona culture, ambuyamudiki. It loosely translates to little grandmother, often a young girl named after an elder, expected to carry that wisdom forward. And you wonder how many little grandmothers once played in these alleys, imitating their matriarchs, already inheriting legacies, not written down, but deeply understood. In Mapungubwe, burial patterns support this theory of female significance. Some women were buried with high-status objects, bangles, gold beads, intricately painted pottery. not tossed in as afterthoughts, but carefully placed. Deliberate, honoring a life of importance. One woman was laid to rest in a seated position facing the river. That's not just symbolism, that's reverence. You peer down into a crumbled chamber, wide enclosed with what might have been a hearth in the center, a communal kitchen, a matriarch's gathering space, or both. The boundaries between domestic and political weren't rigid here. Leadership might have worn bracelets instead of crowns, and its council chamber may have smelled like roasted yams. You pass by a low stone wall, and for no reason you crouch down. There, nearly hidden in the crevice, is a fragment of a carved comb, just a piece, but clearly shaped by hand. Teeth worn smooth by years of use. You imagine it untangling hair while untangling stories. One theory suggests that women in Great Zimbabwe acted as ritual custodians, keepers of ancestral memory, guardians of sacred sites, possibly even spiritual mediators. While men may have ruled from towers, it was women who anchored the lineage, protected the home, and named the next in line. And here's something quirky: in many Bantu cultures, the most revered ancestral spirits are female. Not warriors, but mothers. Fertility wasn't just about babies, it was about continuity. Land heritage reign, all passed through the woman's line. You glance toward a small enclosure beside a wider courtyard. The space feels tucked away, but respected. Maybe a place for midwifery, or birthing rituals, or just a quiet corner where wisdom whispered between generations. Of course, we'll never know for sure, because the stones don't tell us who lived where. They only suggest how. And much of what we believe about gender roles comes filtered through colonial assumptions, where men ruled, women served, and power wore a beard. But you can feel something different here. Not egalitarian in the modern sense, but balanced. Complementary. A place where authority moved sideways as often as upward. You pause by a broken wall, its top capped with the distinctive chevron pattern. You wonder if a woman once stood here during a ceremony, watching her granddaughter dance under the moon. You wonder if she whispered advice no one wrote down, but everyone remembered. Historians still argue whether certain positions like rainmakers, herbalists, and spiritual diviners were gendered or shared. But one thing is certain: women were not passive figures. Their labor, wisdom, and status shaped the city just as much as any tower or wall. You run your hand along the stone again. It's smoother here, maybe from generations leaning, sitting, resting. Maybe from 1,000 palms brushing it on the way to fetch water, tend the fire, hush a child, or cast a blessing. And you wonder, if someone excavated your life centuries from now, what story would they find in your shoes, your handwriting, your half-melted phone? Because here, in the quiet strength of these matrilineal footprints, you're reminded not all leaders leave thrones. Some leave recipes, some leave combs, some leave daughters who remember everything. And when the wind moves through this part of the ruins, it doesn't howl, it murmurs, like a lullaby with teeth. You leave the hush of Great Zimbabwe's heart behind your steps, taking you outward, further south, then east, and then winding north again, chasing fragments. Because the story doesn't stop at the city limits. It spreads. Like seeds on the wind, it scattered across a whole region. And where those seeds landed, more stone cities, more ruins, more mysteries. You find yourself now in Mozambique. It's hotter here, flatter, and somehow dustier, but the echoes are familiar. In a scrub-covered plain, partially hidden beneath tangled undergrowth, and the stubborn insistence of time, rise low stone walls, crumbling but proud. This is Manyakeni. It's not flashy. You wouldn't see it from a plane. But look closer, and the pattern re-emerges. Dry stone construction, circular enclosures, clusters of dwellings, and most curiously, shells. Lots of them. You crouch beside a moss-covered rock and run your fingers along a pale spiral embedded in the dirt. A cowrie shell, found hundreds of kilometers inland. Historians still argue whether this was a ritual site, a market hub, or a royal outpost connected to coastal trade. But there's no denying the pattern. The architectural DNA of Great Zimbabwe repeated here in miniature. Then there's Chibouane, closer to the ocean. You wander toward the wind-swept coastline, where dunes shimmer in the heat, and stumble into an archaeological layer cake, Swahili pottery, Chinese porcelain beads, bones, and coral. Evidence of a once bustling port feeding into the inland empires. These weren't just satellite cities. They were linked, part of a cultural web stretching from Botswana to the Mozambique Channel. At Kami further west, the stonework grows bolder, again terraces, stacked with geometric precision pillars that frame the sunrise stone steps, leading to nowhere and everywhere. At first glance, each site seems isolated, one here another 500 kilometers away, another swallowed by vines in Tanzania. But when you squint just right, like you're looking at a dot-to-dot puzzle on the back of a cereal box, the picture starts to form. The shapes of homes, the curved walls, the particular way the stones taper at the top. It's not a coincidence. You're walking through a network, a stone-threaded civilization without borders, without armies, just culture, memory, and technique passed hand to hand like a favorite story. And then there's Tutswe in southeastern Botswana. Not a city of stone, exactly more of an ancestor to the idea. From around 700 to 1300 AD, it thrived with cattle herding, trade, and ironworking. The houses were clay, the enclosures wood and earth. But the layout eerily familiar. Round huts in ordered clusters, courtyards, ceremonial spaces. You walk through the fields of Tutswe, where the only markers now are low mounds and the occasional post hole. And you wonder, was this where it began? Did the knowledge of stone building travel northward, upward in small jumps like fire passed from torch to torch? There's even evidence that these cultures interacted maybe not formally but practically. Shared trade routes, shared motifs, shared stories. The idea of a stone city wasn't limited to Great Zimbabwe. It was part of a tradition, not centralized, not commanded, just spread, like good gossip or really stubborn architecture. You find a shaded spot near the remnants of a terraced hill at Danamombe, formerly Dlodlo, and plop down with a sigh. The stones here are dry and cracked, but stacked with the same hypnotic care. The pattern holds carefully placed walls, flowing paths, enclosure after enclosure like matryoshka dolls. But here's something quirky. Some of these ruins show features not found at Great Zimbabwe. Square layouts, cross-shaped courtyards, mixed materials. It's like every city took the blueprint then added its own flavor. Yes, let's keep the curved walls, but how about we throw in a sunken courtyard and a stairway to nowhere, just to mess with future archaeologists? You laugh out loud. A lizard blinks at you disapprovingly and scurries off. Even the language adapted. Across regions, dialects shifted. But root words, especially ones for home stone and ancestor, remained strikingly similar. A whisper of continuity in a sea of change. And you begin to appreciate something else. This wasn't an empire in the traditional sense. No single flag, no absolute monarch, no standing army marching from ruin to ruin. It was a cultural phenomenon. An idea shared across space and time, maintained not by force, but by practice. Some scholars call this the Zimbabwe tradition, a kind of socio-cultural continuum, where ideas like stone architecture, cattle, wealth, ancestor, reverence, and trade coexisted over centuries. Not in rigid uniformity, but like cousins showing up to the same family reunion with different snacks. And that makes sense, doesn't it? The best ideas don't need empires to survive. They just need people. People who build, people who remember, people who teach their kids that the wall curves this way, not that way. And when one city fell, another took its place. The stones rose again. The layout changed. The rhythm adjusted. But the song never stopped. You lean back against a weathered wall and stare at the blue sky stretching from Botswana to the sea. It's enormous. It's empty. And yet, it's full. Full of everything that used to be here. And maybe still is if you know how to listen. A breeze picks up whispering through broken stones and scattered shells. And for a moment the entire land feels like a chorus, soft, wide, ancient. And connected. You've followed the stones across the landscape like a breadcrumb trail made from granite, and now you arrive at one of the most elusive sights of all. The place is dry, quiet, and ringed by thorny brush that doesn't care whether you brought sunscreen or not. Welcome to the ruins of the Rosvi. There's no ticket booth, no multilingual plaque, just low walls crumbling under a slow sun and the faint scent of goat in the wind. But make no mistake, this was once the beating heart of something vast. An empire without clear borders, a dynasty without fanfare, the Rosvi Empire. Their story is harder to trace. The name Rosvi doesn't light up textbooks the way Mali or Axum might. And yet for over 200 years from the late 1600s into the early 1800s, they ruled the interior of southern Africa with remarkable coordination, spiritual heft, and a stubborn refusal to be ordinary. Historians still argue whether the Rosvi directly descended from the rulers of Great Zimbabwe or simply inherited its legacy through cultural osmosis. But either way, the stonework here, the walls of places like Dlodlo Manyanga and Nalatale echoes those ancient rhythms. You run your fingers across the wall at Nalatale. Unlike Great Zimbabwe's smooth curves, this one bristles with geometric patterns, herringbone-checkered even zigzag bands that look like someone tried to quilt stone. It's flashier, it's got flair. It's the architectural equivalent of someone saying, "Oh, I understood the assignment." Some believe these stone embellishments were symbolic, representing clans, social ranks, or even cosmological beliefs. Others think it was just the Rosvi showing off. Either way, the craftsmanship is breathtaking. You picture a stonemason at work, wiping sweat from his brow, stepping back to admire a row of perfectly laid dentelle patterns, and muttering, "That'll keep the ancestors smiling." And speaking of ancestors, oh, they mattered here. Rosvi kings claimed sacred authority through their connection to spiritual forces. Rainmakers, spirit mediums, custodians of memory. Power didn't just come from spears. It came from ritual, from silence, from the ancestors nodding in agreement behind a veil you didn't dare disturb. You reach the ruins of Manyanga, where low enclosures creep along a wooded ridge. There's a stillness here that doesn't feel empty. It feels guarded, like someone's watching. Not menacing, just careful. Somewhere nearby, you're told, was once the burial site of a Rosvi king. No elaborate tombstone, just a mound. Maybe marked by a tree, maybe not marked at all. Deliberate anonymity so that the site would never be looted, never desecrated. It's a powerful move, protecting your dead by letting the landscape forget them physically, but remember them spiritually. And that fits the Rosvi-style, perfectly subtle command. You never know exactly how much power they had, only that everyone around them adjusted their behavior accordingly. They resisted Portuguese incursions, pushed back against rival tribes, and enforced their authority with a blend of trade control, spiritual prestige, and, when necessary, military strength. But they didn't leave statues, no royal portraits, no epic poems chiseled into rock. Their legacy is quieter. But you start to realize that quietness, that's confidence they also built without writing. Again, You're used to this by now. Oral tradition did the heavy lifting. And for generations, Rosvi names were passed down with reverence. Some families today still claim descent from those kings whispering stories beside cooking fires or into newborn ears. And then there are the lions. At Tlodlo, you find fragments of carved stone lions, slightly stylized, vaguely frowny. Guardians, totems. Historians still argue whether they symbolized royal power, ancestral protection, or just a cultural nod to the real lions wandering nearby. You stare into the pitted eye of one of them and wonder what it watched. A coronation A ceremony, an argument about grain taxes. But here's a little fringe tidbit for you. Local legends say that Rosvi rulers could disappear at will. Not metaphorically, literally. Vanish, usually right before danger arrived. Some said it was magic, others said it was strategy and elite escape network, cloaked in supernatural rumor. Either way, no Rosvi king was ever captured, not by the Portuguese, not by rivals. They slipped into myth just like their cities. Eventually, colonial disruptions, disease, and internal decline cracked the Rosvi structure. One by one, their outposts faded. Their names slid into silence. Their walls crumbled into curious mounds on forgotten maps. But they didn't go nowhere. You're sitting in their remains right now, and the ground still feels steady beneath you. The wind still curves just right through the stones. And as the sun dips lower, casting the thorn trees into silhouette, you realize some empires declare their greatness with gold and banners. Others do it with silence, with mystery, with lions made of stone. You brush the dust off your pants, stand up slowly, and give the ruins one last nod. They nod back. You've chased stone trails across southern Africa, zigzagged through ruins and rumors, and now you find yourself on a path most tourists never tread. The jungle is thick here, green and wet, and smelling of rain even when it hasn't rained in days. Branches tug at your sleeves. The air clings to your skin. And somewhere beneath your boots, something ancient is buried. Because in the Democratic Republic of Congo and Tanzania, even in Malawi and Zambia, far beyond the spotlight of Great Zimbabwe, there are ghost cities swallowed by roots and silence. You might miss them entirely if you weren't looking. But you are looking. And suddenly you begin to see. Low stone foundations peeking from the underbrush, mounds with unnatural curves, broken pottery shards half sunk in soil, places like Bigo in Uganda or Engaruka in northern Tanzania, quiet, unassuming names for civilizations that once buzzed with life. You stop near one such ruin, a tangle of stones in the shadow of a fig tree, and crouch. The structure is simple but familiar. A circular base, possibly a home, maybe even a granary. You brush away a layer of damp leaves and find charcoal. Burned, blackened, still resting where it fell who knows how many centuries ago. You sniff. Smells like old smoke and the edge of memory. Historians still argue whether these sites were part of the same cultural sphere as Great Zimbabwe or distant cousins that evolved separately. The similarities are compelling dry stone masonry trade goods from faraway lands and an unmistakable sense of planning. Not just survival. Society. Engaruka, for instance, sits along the base of a mountain range in what is now a dusty, sun-blasted plain. But once it had a sophisticated irrigation system, terraced fields, fed by long, stone-lined canals. That's not casual farming. That's infrastructure, engineering, urban planning East African edition. And no one knows where the people went. There are theories, of course. Climate shifts, overgrazing, conflict, migration. Maybe they left because they wanted to, because they had options, because they were connected to something bigger than just their village. You wipe your hands on your pants and glance toward the jungle's edge where a strange quiet reigns. No birdsong, no rustle, just a breath held in stone. Then there's the site of Bigo in Uganda, farther north, and surrounded by earthworks that sprawl for miles. Banks and ditches, circular enclosures, ritual mounds. It's not stone per se, but it feels like the same idea. Control of space, a dance between earth and architecture. Artifacts found there suggest trade was alive, and well-ironed tools, glass beads, even seashells. Imagine the journey those shells took from the Indian Ocean up rivers through hands and languages and marketplaces to end up here 100 to 200 kilometers from any wave. You start to realize something big. These cities weren't outliers. They were nodes. Connective tissue in a vast network of interaction and innovation. Trade didn't just run east to west. It ran up and down in spirals, in loops through the forest, over the hills, and occasionally under the radar of every textbook you ever had to suffer through in school. And that's the fringe mystery, isn't it? If all these places were linked, if the architecture, artifacts, and patterns align, why don't we hear more about them? Because they're not flashy. Because the jungles took them back. Because they were too smart to build giant ego monuments that shout, "I am king," in marble and gold. Maybe. Or maybe they just trusted the earth to remember. You stand and walk further along the ridge where a trail thins to nearly nothing. A few more stones dot the undergrowth. One of them, tall and upright, might have been a marker, a grave, a boundary post. You rest your hand on it and close your eyes. If the stones could speak here, they'd whisper stories of slow-building cities of banana beer, shared under a full moon, of distant cousins passing along news from the coast. They'd tell you of paths worn down by 1,000 market days, of quiet laughter echoing off terraces, of a grandmother's song, of the day the people packed up and walked away, not out of fear, but because they could. That's the thing about cities. They don't always die. Sometimes they get retired. Let go. Like a well-used pot passed onto the earth. And the jungle. It doesn't erase. It preserves, just not in the way we like. No clean walls, no guided tours, just hints, bones, seeds, a curve of stone that makes you pause for no good reason except that your body remembers a rhythm your brain never learned. You step out of the shade back into sunlight and look over the canopy. Somewhere below, more ruins wait, still unsurveyed, still unnamed. And you start to wonder, how many civilizations have we simply forgotten? Not because they failed, but because they were quiet, because they didn't need to shout. The jungle parts just a little, and you're back on a dusty trail. Not a grand avenue, just a humble footpath winding through overgrown grass, the kind that sticks to your ankles and refuses to let go. You follow it because something's pulling you forward. Not curiosity this time, but a sense of righteous indignation. Because you've seen the cities. You've felt the silence. And now it's time to face something noisier, louder than any stone wall, more stubborn than any ruin. It's time to talk about denial. You arrive at a makeshift museum in an old colonial building. The ceiling fans wheeze. The exhibits are faded. One of the plaques reads, "Possible non-African origin." You squint. You reread. And then you roll your eyes so hard you nearly sprain something. Because this is the part of the story where things get weird, and not in the fun lions with magical powers kind of way. In the deeply uncomfortable, historically awkward, wildly condescending kind of way. When Europeans first encountered the ruins of Great Zimbabwe in the 16th and 17th centuries, their reaction was not wonder. It was denial. These couldn't have been built by Africans. That was the consensus. Too sophisticated, too advanced, too organized. The logic. Well, we've colonized them, and they don't build stone cities now, so clearly they never did. Historians still argue whether early Portuguese accounts genuinely misunderstood or willfully ignored the truth. But by the time British colonials arrived in the 19th century, the denial was fully institutionalized. Explorers like Karl Mauch, insisted the city was built by outsiders, Phoenicians, perhaps, or survivors of the Queen of Sheba's court. Or aliens. Because when in doubt, blame aliens. Mauch even claimed the Great Zimbabwe Walls were a replica of King Solomon's temple. He found a piece of cedar wood and took it as proof. Never mind that the tree wasn't native. Never mind that no other evidence supported this. He wanted it to be true. So he said it. And people listened. For decades, the official narrative taught in schools published in books erased African hands from African stone. Excavations were tampered with. Artifacts were reinterpreted. One archaeologist, Gertrude Caton Thompson, did prove conclusively in 1929 that the city was built by African peoples using African methods for African purposes. And then they mostly ignored her too. You sit on a low bench beside an old display case, dust motes catching the light. Inside, there's a soapstone bird head, chipped but proud. The label says, "Unknown Origin." You mutter, "Yeah, okay," and give it a wink. Because deep down you know what this is about. It wasn't just about stone, it was about control, about the stories people choose to tell when they want to justify taking land, resources, identity. It's easier to say these people never built anything than to admit we found them living in the ruins of greatness we don't understand. And that's the legacy that still clings quietly, like mildew. A generation of books, maps, and lectures that insisted on a fantasy because the truth was inconvenient. But here's the good news. The stones never cared. They never stopped standing, never stopped whispering. And now the truth is rising again. Schools in Zimbabwe teach the real history. Local archaeologists lead digs. Heritage sites celebrate the genius of builders who worked without blueprints, without books, but with vision. You walk out of the museum and into the bright afternoon feeling equal parts inspired and grumpy. Because it's one thing to forget a civilization. It's another to bury it under lies. But you also start to laugh because, seriously, Phoenicians, that's like finding a peanut butter sandwich in your neighbor's kitchen and assuming it came from ancient Greece. Sure, possible, but highly unlikely. You remember one theory popular in the 1800s, that Great Zimbabwe was built by wandering Israelites who lost their way, settled down, built a stone metropolis, and then quietly disappeared without ever telling anyone. Solid historical logic, right? And yet these theories made it into textbooks, into policies, into justifications for colonial occupation, because when you control the narrative, you control the land. The past becomes property, and those soapstone birds, they become trophies. Even today, debates continue over who gets to keep certain artifacts. Should they be in European museums, in private collections, or in the soil where they were born? You know the answer. You head toward the edge of the site where schoolchildren sit in a semicircle sketching the ruins in their notebooks. One of them draws the conical tower. Another shades in the curving walls. A third adds stars above the walls, maybe dreaming of the sky alignments you imagined earlier. You smile. Because this is what reclamation looks like. Not vengeance, not shouting, just kids sketching what's theirs. Quietly, firmly, and those theories, those tired, sun-bleached denials, they'll crumble just like bad masonry. Because truth like stone lasts, especially when it's curved with care and placed by hands that remember what they're doing. You leave behind the museum, the myths, the mismatched theories, and instead wander to the edge of a dig site, a real one. No fanfare. Just a sun-faded tarp, a few trowels scattered nearby, and a couple of archaeologists gently hunched over what looks from a distance like a very determined attempt to tickle the dirt. They don't look up as you approach. They're in that zone part, meditation part obsession. One of them mutters something about stratigraphy. The other brushes soil away from a clay shard with the tenderness of a parent wiping jam off a toddler's face. You sit down nearby, careful not to knock over anything that might be, the sacred jawbone of an ancient ancestor, or someone's extremely historic ashtray. It's quiet work, slow, surgical, and deeply respectful. Because here's the thing, archaeology in these parts isn't just about artifacts. It's about correction, about rebuilding stories that were flattened, repressed, or painted over. Every bead, every bone, every iron tool, gently lifted from the soil, is a vote for memory. A rebuttal to centuries of they never built anything. You lean closer to the grid being excavated 10 by 10 squares, roped off with twine. Within one, someone has uncovered a small copper ornament. Possibly a bracelet, possibly a pendant, possibly a 100-year-old bottle cap. The earth doesn't label things, but when the archaeologist lifts it slowly, reverently, it gleams just slightly in the sun. You hold your breath, they do too. Then they whisper, "Looks like early smelting. This alloy doesn't match Portuguese trade copper, which means it was local, refined here, formed here, worn here, a small thing, but also a big thing." Because metallurgy was widespread across southern Africa long before outsiders noticed. Great Zimbabwe had iron-working furnaces. Mapungubwe had goldsmiths. Kilns lined with clay bellows made from animal hide, smelting that required serious heat control. This wasn't guesswork. It was science. Learned by doing. Passed down. Not written, but practiced. Historians still argue whether these early metallurgists worked alone or in guild-like structures, whether their knowledge was spiritual, scientific, or both. But the tools don't lie. Slag heaps, iron bloom, and bead furnaces all tell the same story. These people understood fire pressure and patience. You wander toward a pit where a small cluster of smoking pipes was discovered, intricately carved. Some with animal motifs, some so worn they seem fused to the earth. You pick one up carefully and imagine its former owner sitting on a stone bench, watching the market bustle, exhaling slowly, while the city hummed around him. Trade goods, laughter, dust, the faint smell of spiced tobacco curling upward toward the birds. Archaeologists call these contextual finds. You call them time machines. A few meters away, another trench reveals bead caches. Ostrich shell, glass. One tiny red bead you swear you've seen before at Mapungubwe, maybe. It's like finding a cousin at a family reunion you didn't even know you had. And then there are the bones. You glance over at a careful row of laid-out remains, not whole skeletons, but fragments. A jaw, a femur, a few vertebrae. A quiet cluster of people who never meant to be unearthed. There's no spectacle here, just silence. The archaeologist wraps each fragment in gauze, whispers something under their breath, and logs the coordinates with almost reverent precision. Because this isn't about relics, it's about people, real people, with names and voices and stories you'll never hear but whose bones still remember how they stood, how they danced, how they carried water and worry. Some of the burials show signs of status bracelets, beads, careful orientation toward the rising sun. Others are simpler. A grave is a grave. But even in the simplicity, there's design, there's care, and there's continuity. You turn toward a shaded table where a few artifacts are being cataloged. One object catches your eye, a carved fragment of soapstone, not quite a bird, not quite abstract. A pattern. A symbol. You ask the archaeologist and they shrug. We're not sure. Might have been ceremonial, or just decoration, or something else entirely. That's archaeology in a nutshell, isn't it? 100% certainty. That we're only 5% certain. And yet with every brushstroke, every labeled baggie, a picture sharpens. A picture that had been blurred, rewritten, or left out altogether. You learn about new techniques, ground-penetrating radar isotopic analysis, even ancient DNA sampling. tools that are now peeling back the layers of soil and silence. One researcher explains how they're tracing migration patterns through strontium levels in human teeth. Another talks about residue analysis on ceramic vessels, finding traces of oil grain and even fermented drinks that might predate your favorite local brewery by several centuries. You grin. So you're telling me these people had craft beer, possibly banana beer, the archaeologist replies without missing a beat. Sweet flat, and with questionable branding. You laugh. The bones don't laugh. But they don't mind. Because they know their story is being told, again, slowly, respectfully, honestly. You look back one more time at the dig site. It's not grand, it's not dramatic, but it's real. Every brushstroke says, "We see you now." Every tiny find whispers you were never forgotten, just misfiled. And now you're helping refold her history one layer of soil at a time. You return to the stones one last time, not to decode or to dig or to debate, not to unearth anything new, just to sit, to listen, to be with them. The late afternoon sun drips across the granite in long, lazy lines. The walls cast familiar shadows, soft curves curling across the earth, like the city is tucking itself in. A breeze sighs through the grass, rattling the dry pods of a nearby tree. And above you the sky has gone that quiet blue that only happens before dusk, when the day is ready to sleep but hasn't quite decided to. You lean back against a sun-warmed wall. The same wall someone else leaned on 600 years ago, perhaps, while thinking about goats, or the harvest, or whether anyone would remember them. The answer, of course, is yes, because even if their names are gone, the stones remember. The layout remembers. The wind curling through carefully stacked walls remembers. Great Zimbabwe, Mapungubwe, Kami, Naletal, Chibuene, Manyikeni, Dlodlo, Bigo, Engaruka, and the dozens, maybe hundreds of other places not even marked on maps, still waiting for someone to wander by and ask, "What's this?" What you've seen isn't the footprint of an empire or the echo of a forgotten dynasty. It's something bigger, a culture that understood place, understood memory, understood that you could carve permanence from stone, not for ego, but for continuity. Historians still argue whether these builders saw themselves as part of something greater, whether they understood the legacy they were laying one granite block at a time. But you've walked the alleys, you've stood in the sound traps, you've watched stars rise between stone pillars. You know, this wasn't an accident. It wasn't primitive, it wasn't isolated, it was intentional, layered, interconnected, sacred. You think back to that soapstone bird, the one chipped at the beak, but still proud. It wasn't just an emblem, it was a sentinel, a memory anchor, a declaration carved in silence that said, "We are here, we know what we're doing, you'll come back eventually." And now you have. You close your eyes, you let the dust settle on your skin, you let the evening come, because you know something else too. The stones don't need you to tell their story. They've been whispering it this whole time. Through pattern, through silence, through songs only the wind knows how to carry. But your voice, you're noticing it, helps. It's part of the echo. So as the sun slips behind the wall, as the goat bleats in the distance one last time, and the cicadas start up their night shift symphony, you rise. You walk slowly back through the curved alleys. You feel the smooth stone under your fingers. You pass through one last narrow path and glance over your shoulder. The walls don't wave, but they feel like they do. Because tonight you listened, and the stones, they still speak. The journey ends now quietly. The stars are out soft pinpricks against a velvet sky. You're no longer walking. You're floating almost through the memories of stone cities, built not with noise, but with intention. You let the stories you've heard settle in like warm sand, heavy in the best way, grounding you. Every curved wall, every goat trail, every whispered debate between scholars and wind, it's all folded gently into silence now. You're not alone in your wonder. You never were. Across centuries, generations have stood where you stood. They cooked in those hearths, whispered secrets through those corridors, and built futures with their hands and a few perfect stones. Let their rhythm rock you to rest. Let the quiet confidence of a civilization that didn't need to shout ease the tension from your jaw, your shoulders, your chest. Inhale slowly. Hold. Exhale even slower. Let go of needing all the answers. Let the questions hum quietly in the background, like a distant drumbeat you don't need to follow anymore, because the stones are still there, watching, waiting, humming in harmony with the sky, and you've heard them now. Let that be enough for tonight. Let the hush of great Zimbabwe cradle you, the dust of Mapungubwe settle on your dreams, and the soapstone birds perch gently on the edge of your sleep. You are held, you are safe, you are resting now. Good night.